He was a heartbroken veteran who came back to his late father's old house, hoping only for silence. But when his loyal dog Cooper began digging beneath the shed, he uncovered a secret buried for decades, a hidden spring, a forgotten journal, and a truth that would change everything Ethan believed about his father and himself. It is a story of loss, courage, and faith. A reminder that sometimes miracles are not found in grand moments, but in quiet acts of love and loyalty that heal broken hearts and rebuild broken towns. May this story bring you hope and peace as you listen. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The afternoon sun hung low above the hills of Hollow Ridge, turning the dry grass a soft shade of amber. A light breeze passed through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and warm soil. It was the kind of quiet that could both comfort and haunt a man who had spent too long among noise and chaos. Ethan Miller stood on the porch of the old wooden house that had belonged to his father. The house was small, with faded blue shutters and a roof that sagged like a weary soldier's shoulders. The paint had peeled in thin strips along the siding, and the porch steps groaned beneath his boots. It was not much, but it was home now. He was 42 tall and broad-shouldered, his skin tanned and rough from years beneath desert suns and battlefield dust. A faint scar ran along his left jaw, the souvenir of a night he preferred not to remember. His hazel eyes carried the look of a man who had seen too much and spoken too little. His beard, short and flecked with gray, gave him a rugged, unshaven dignity. There was a heaviness in the way he moved, as though each step reminded him of the men who never made it home. Inside the house, light filtered through the thin curtains, falling across furniture covered in a fine layer of dust. The place smelled of cedar oil and faintly of his father's old tobacco. Ethan had inherited the house after the funeral 2 years ago, but he had only now found the courage to return. For months, he had drifted through jobs towns and sleepless nights before ending up back where everything had begun. Near the kitchen door, a rust-colored dog stirred and lifted his head. Cooper was a 5-year-old golden retriever with eyes the color of honey and a coat that caught the sunlight like gold thread. He had been a rescue from the base shelter overseas, a dog who had once lost his handler in combat. Ethan liked to think that fate had brought them together, two broken creatures looking for the same thing, a reason to keep breathing. Cooper's stretched tail, thumping softly against the floor before padding toward him. Ethan poured water into an old metal bowl, watching the dog lap it up. The simple sound filled the silence that had grown too heavy. He often talked to Cooper, even when words felt useless. The dog did not answer, but he listened. And sometimes that was all a man needed. The day passed slowly. Ethan spent the afternoon repairing the porch railing that had come loose during last winter storms. The rhythm of hammer against nail gave him a sense of purpose he had long forgotten. Sweat beaded across his forehead, and his shirt stuck to his back. But it felt good, the kind of honest labor that grounded him in the present. Cooper lay in the shade, eyes half-closed, ears flicking at flies. Every so often, the dog would glance at him, as if to make sure he was still there, still real. As evening settled, the golden light faded to soft gray. Crickets began their chorus in the field behind the house, and the sound of a distant truck rolled down the empty road. Ethan leaned against the porch post, wiping his hands on a rag. He could see the town lights faintly blinking beyond the ridge, Hollow Ridge population, barely 2,000. He had grown up here, the son of a quiet carpenter named Henry Miller. His father had been a tall, wiry man with a slow voice and patient eyes, known for building everything by hand. Henry had worked himself into the ground, one table, one chair, one fence post at a time. When Ethan enlisted at 19, his father had not tried to stop him. He had simply shaken his hand and said, "Find something worth keeping, son." Ethan had found many things in the war, fear, loyalty, loss, but nothing he wanted to keep. When he came home years later, his father was already gone. The house was empty, except for a few tools, a few photographs, and the echo of a man who had always believed in fixing what was broken. The memories pressed in on him as he sat on the porch steps, arms resting on his knees. Cooper came over and rested his head on Ethan's thigh. The gesture was quiet but grounding. He scratched the dog ear and spoke under his breath. "You and me, buddy. Just you and me now." The night deepened. Stars spread across the sky, bright and sharp against the velvet dark. Somewhere far off, a train horn drifted through the air. It reminded Ethan of the convoys, the restless movement, the never-ending noise of orders and engines. Out here, the stillness felt almost foreign. He thought of the men he had lost, the ones whose names he could still hear in his dreams. He remembered the sandstorms that erased the horizon, the nights spent with nothing but a rifle and the sound of his own heartbeat. And now here he was, in a house that creaked when the wind passed through, with only a loyal dog for company. There were days when he wondered if this was all that was left for him. He was not sure what he was supposed to rebuild. The army had taught him how to survive, not how to live. Yet as he looked at the dim outline of his father's workbench through the window, he felt something stir, a memory of sawdust in the air, of steady hands shaping wood, of quiet creation instead of destruction. He walked inside, picked up one of his father's old tools, and turned it over in his hands. The metal was cool, worn smooth from years of use. He set it down again, not ready yet, but somehow comforted by its presence. Cooper followed him, circling once before lying near the doorhead on his paws. The silence was no longer empty. It was simply waiting. Outside, the moon rose high above the ridge, silvering the fields and the roof of the small wooden house. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, boots still on, and let the quiet wrap around him. Cooper shifted closer, pressing his warm body against his leg. For the first time in a long while, Ethan did not feel the need to run. The road behind him was long and full of ghosts, but the road ahead, though uncertain, felt lighter. There was work to do tomorrow. The porch still needed mending, the fence needed new posts, and maybe he could find a way to start again. When sleep finally came, it was gentle. Outside, the crickets kept singing. Inside, two souls, one man and one dog, rested beneath the same roof, learning slowly, quietly, what it meant to belong again. The air was heavy that afternoon, the kind of heat that made the sky seem to sag and the leaves hang still. Clouds gathered low over the hills of Hollow Ridge, and thunder rolled softly in the distance. The scent of rain drifted through the open windows of the old wooden house, and Cooper lay near the door, restless, his ears twitching at each rumble of the sky. Ethan sat at his workbench, sanding the leg of a chair he had promised to fix for the widow down the road. Sweat rolled down his temples and mixed with sawdust on his skin. The rhythmic motion of his hands calmed him, the same way it had since the day he returned home. Outside, the air darkened until it turned a deep gray, and then the first drops of rain fell slow and deliberate against the porch roof. Cooper lifted his head and whined softly. Ethan looked up from his work. "Easy, boy," he said in a low voice. "It is just a storm." But Cooper's ears stayed perked and his eyes fixed on the window. Moments later, the rain grew harder, a quick rush, like a curtain being pulled across the world. Then there was a sound, different from the wind, a faint knock almost lost under the thunder. Ethan stood still, listening. The knock came again, this time louder, hurried, almost afraid. Cooper barked and ran to the door, tail stiff. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and walked over. When he opened the door, a small figure stood trembling in the downpour. She was a girl, maybe 12 years old, soaked to the bone, her dark hair plastered against her cheeks. Her clothes clung to her thin frame, and her sneakers squelched in the mud. Her face was pale and streaked with rain, but her eyes were bright with fright and confusion. Ethan recognized her faintly from the houses farther down the road. He stepped aside and spoke gently. "Come in. You will catch your death out there." The girl hesitated for a second, as if afraid to move, then crossed the threshold. Cooper sniffed her shoes, tail wagging cautiously, before circling her once and sitting beside her as if declaring her under his protection. Ethan closed the door and grabbed a towel from the chair. "Here, dry off." The girl's lips trembled. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice small and shaky. "I got lost. I was trying to get home before Mama's shift ends, but the road flooded and I could not find the turn." Ethan handed her the towel and studied her quietly. She was small and fragile, but there was something determined in her eyes. Her name, he remembered now, was Lily Harper, the daughter of Sarah Harper, the woman who cleaned rooms at the motel near the highway. People in town spoke kindly of Sarah, a single mother in her late 30s, tall and slim, with a quiet dignity and tired eyes that always smiled for others, even when her own world was falling apart. Ethan had seen her once at the market counting coins in her palm before paying for bread and milk. He crouched near the fire pit in the corner and added wood. The flames flared up, warming the room. "Sit by the fire," he said. "You will warm faster." Cooper settled next to her, pressing his body close to share his heat. The girl smiled weakly and stroked the dog head, her fingers trembling, but her shoulders relaxing little by little. Ethan went to the kitchen, poured warm water into a pot, and added leftover stew from earlier that day. The smell of vegetables and herbs filled the small space. When he handed her the bowl, Lily took it with both hands, whispering a shy thank you before eating in silence. Each spoonful seemed to melt the cold away from her small frame. While she ate, Ethan sat across the room, watching the rain beat against the window. He remembered being her age, once lost in storms of his own making. Life had a way of testing even the smallest souls. He felt something tighten in his chest, that mix of protectiveness and sorrow he had tried to keep buried. When the thunder softened and the rain turned to a soft drizzle, Lily set the bowl down. She looked at the floor, then at him. "My mama will be worried. She works at the motel past the bridge. She was supposed to come home after midnight. I wanted to surprise her with flowers from the field, but I dropped them when it started raining." Her voice cracked on the last word. Ethan rubbed his hands together, the skin rough and calloused. "You can stay here until the rain stops. I will walk you home later if the road clears." Lily nodded, her eyes brimming, but she blinked fast, refusing to cry. Cooper lifted his head, resting it gently on her knee. The gesture drew a small smile from her. They sat like that for a long time while outside the world calmed. The rain softened into a rhythm steady and almost soothing. The smell of wet earth drifted in, mixing with smoke from the fireplace. Ethan leaned back in his chair, letting the warmth seep into his bones. For years, the sound of rain had reminded him of faraway tents and explosions hidden beneath the hum of weather. But tonight, it was only rain. He watched the girl doze beside the fire, her face peaceful now, her hand resting on Cooper fur. Something in that image reached deep into him, the kind of stillness he had not known for years. It made him think of the life he might have had if things had gone differently, if the war had not stolen his youth and scattered it across deserts he would never see again. When the rain stopped, Ethan rose quietly. He opened the window to let in the cool night air. The crickets had returned, and the frogs down by the creek sang in the dark. Cooper yawned, stretched, and lay near the door, watching him with calm, trusting eyes. Ethan turned off the lamp, leaving only the soft glow from the fire. He sat back down and spoke low so his voice would not wake her. "We have company tonight, buddy?" Cooper thumped his tail once, as if in agreement. As the fire dimmed, the small house felt less empty. The weight that had pressed on Ethan's chest since his return seemed to lift just a little. Maybe it was the company of a child who reminded him that the world could still be innocent. Maybe it was the sound of a dog breathing beside him. Or maybe it was simply that, for the first time in a long while, he was needed again. When dawn began to rise pale and soft over the hills, Lily stirred awake. Her clothes had dried by the fire, her hair curling slightly from the heat. Ethan handed her a slice of bread and said quietly, "We can go when you are ready." She nodded, holding Cooper by the collar as they stepped outside. The ground was damp and shining under the early sun. Birds sang from the trees as though nothing had ever been broken. They walked the muddy road together in silence until they reached a small yellow house near the end of the lane. Sarah Harper stood on the porch, her uniform still on from her night shift, her dark hair tied back her face, weary but kind. When she saw Lily, she ran down the steps and knelt, hugging her tight. Tears of relief filled her brown eyes. Ethan stood back, watching mother and daughter cling to each other. Sarah looked up after a moment, her voice soft and hoarse from exhaustion. "Thank you for bringing her home. I do not know what I would have done." Ethan nodded awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. "She is brave. She found her way even in the rain." Sarah smiled faintly, that tired but genuine smile of someone who had learned to survive more storms than weather alone. When they parted ways, Sarah waved once before leading her daughter inside. Ethan turned back toward the ridge, Cooper trotting beside him, his tail swaying through the wet grass. The morning light touched the house ahead, turning its old boards to gold. For the first time since he had come home, Ethan felt something stir in the quiet corner of his heart. It was not quite peace, but it was close. That night, when he sat on the porch, Cooper at his feet, he found himself glancing down the road where the Harpers lived. The wind was gentle, and the air smelled of rain and earth. He realized that maybe the world still had a place for him after all. The morning sun rose behind thin clouds, spreading a pale light across Hollow Ridge. The air smelled of dry wood and sawdust drifting from the small workshop near the edge of town. Birds sang faintly from the telephone wires, while the hum of early traffic echoed through the narrow streets. It was the kind of morning that usually promised peace, but not for Ethan Miller. Ethan arrived at the workshop just after 7, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone lukewarm. The building was old, a long shed of gray timber with a tin roof that rattled in the wind. Inside, the smell of pine and varnish mixed with oil and smoke. The workshop had been his second home for almost a year, a place where the rhythm of hammering drowned out the noise inside his head. Cooper followed him as always, tail wagging slightly, though he sensed something uneasy in his master that morning. The owner, Mr. Grant, was already there leaning against the big work table by the door. He was in his late 50s, short and thick-shouldered, with a belly that pressed against his suspenders. His hair, once dark, was now gray around the temples, and his beard was trimmed close to his jaw. His hands were rough, but steady, the hands of a man who had built things his whole life. Normally, Mr. Grant greeted Ethan with a nod or a small grin, but today his eyes were distant and tired. "Morning," Sir Ethan said, setting down his cup. Mr. Grant did not answer right away. He rubbed his forehead, then looked up with a sigh. "Ethan, I will not go around it. The workshop has been sold." For a moment, the words hung between them like dust in sunlight. Ethan blinked, unsure he had heard correctly. Sold to who? Some company from the city. Mr. Grant said, his voice heavy. They want to build vacation cabins up the ridge. The owner of the land made a deal, and I cannot fight it. We have 2 weeks, maybe less, before they start clearing everything. Ethan felt something close tighten in his chest. The sound of the rain on that roof, the smell of glue and smoke, the hum of saws, all of it had been his anchor. Without it, he was drifting again. Mr. Grant looked at him with a mix of regret and guilt. "You are one of the best hands I have got, Ethan. If I could keep the place, I would. But I am too old to start over." Ethan nodded slowly. He had learned long ago that some losses came without warning, like the snap of a rope under weight. He looked down at his hands, the lines of scars and calluses crossing like a map of old battles. He asked quietly, "What will you do now?" Mr. Grant shrugged his heavy shoulders. "Maybe move down to my brother farm near the coast. Try fishing instead of fixing things." There was a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. He placed a hand on Ethan's arm. "You are a good man. Do not let this shut you down." Ethan tried to answer, but no words came. Cooper stood beside him, pressing against his leg, sensing the quiet tremor that had begun deep inside his master. The rest of the morning passed in silence, broken only by the sound of tools being packed away. Each hammer, each chisel carried a story. Ethan wrapped them carefully as though they were pieces of himself. Around noon, he walked out of the workshop into the bright sun. The light hurt his eyes. He stood for a long time staring at the hills beyond the town, where he could already imagine machines tearing through the trees. That evening, he returned home later than usual. The house felt emptier than before. He sat on the porch, his elbows on his knees, staring at the dirt road. Cooper lay at his feet, looking up now and then, with those amber eyes full of questions. Ethan took a slow breath. He thought of the faces from his unit men who had vanished in smoke and fire. He thought of promises made and broken. He thought of his father, who had built furniture with patience, not profit. Somewhere between those memories, he found the thin thread of resolve that had always kept him moving forward. The next morning, he decided to visit Lily and her mother. Their small yellow house stood near the end of Willow Street, surrounded by a fence half rotted at the base. The yard was cluttered with old flower pots and a rusted swing. Sarah Harper stood outside hanging laundry, her dark hair tied back and her sleeves rolled above her elbows. The morning light showed the faint hollows under her eyes, the kind carved by years of exhaustion and worry. But when she saw Ethan, her expression softened. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice calm but curious. "What brings you here this early?" Ethan rubbed his hands together awkwardly. "I heard the wind took down part of your fence last night. Thought I could help fix it before it gets worse." Sarah smiled faintly. "That fence has been threatening to fall for months. I suppose it finally gave up." She glanced at him a moment, as if measuring his intentions, then nodded toward the yard. "If you want to try, I will get you a hammer." Cooper trotted beside him, sniffing the grass tail, wagging gently. Lily came running out the door, barefoot, and bright-eyed, her hair braided loosely down her back. She dropped to her knees to hug Cooper, who responded by licking her cheek until she laughed. Ethan began working on the fence, pulling out nails and replacing broken boards. The steady rhythm of the hammer brought back a small sense of order. Sarah brought him water and stood nearby, folding dry clothes. Up close, she looked even more fragile than he remembered, tall but lean, her skin pale from long hours indoors. Yet there was strength in her hands, the kind that came from never having anyone to lean on. After a while, she spoke quietly without looking at him. "Lily told me what you did the night of the storm. She said you sat with her until she fell asleep. Thank you for that." Ethan paused the hammer midair. "She is a brave girl," he said simply. "She reminded me of someone I once knew." Sarah nodded faintly. "This town forgets kindness fast. It means more than you think." He did not answer. Words felt too small for what he wanted to say. He kept working until the fence stood firm again. The air smelled of grass and the faint sweetness of detergent from the laundry line. For a moment, he felt almost human again. When he finished, Lily handed him a small flower she had picked near the ditch. It was a simple white daisy bent slightly at the stem. "For you," she said shyly. Cooper barked once, as if approving the gesture. Ethan smiled, the expression awkward but real. Later that afternoon, as he walked home, he realized how strange it felt to belong somewhere, even for a few hours. The job at the workshop might be gone, but maybe purpose could come from smaller things, fixing what was in front of him piece by piece. That night, he sat by the fire, turning his father's old chisel in his hands. Cooper lay near the hearth, snoring softly. The light flickered against the walls, filling the room with warmth. Outside, the wind rustled the dry leaves along the road, and the distant sound of frogs echoed through the dusk. Ethan leaned back, closing his eyes. He could almost hear the rhythm of the workshop, again, hammers striking wood sawdust floating in sunlight. He thought of Mr. Grant, of Sarah and Lily, of the fence that now stood straight and steady. Maybe that was what life was now, building small things that lasted even when everything else fell apart. When he finally went to bed, the night was quiet. Cooper climbed up beside him, laying his head near Ethan's arm. The world outside might still be uncertain, but here, inside the old house, there was a fragile kind of peace. Ethan let it settle over him, like the smell of wood and smoke, and the faint memory of hope returning at last. The morning air carried the smell of damp earth and cut grass. A faint mist clung to the fields of Hollow Ridge as the first rays of sunlight slid over the wooden fences and the slanted roof of Ethan Miller Old House. It was a cool morning, after a short night of rain, the kind of quiet that seemed to hide something beneath it. Ethan stood near the back of the house with a cup of black coffee in his hand. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his hair still damp from washing, and the tired lines around his eyes deepened in the soft light. He had not been sleeping well. Since the workshop had closed, he had spent more time repairing things around the property, trying to fill the silence with the rhythm of tools. Cooper, his golden retriever with honey-colored fur, ran around the yard, sniffing everything, as if the rain had rewritten the world overnight. The dog was restless that morning, tail high and ears twitching. Ethan watched him for a moment, amused by the way the dog circled near the old shed that stood behind the house. The shed was built by his father many years ago, its wooden planks faded to gray, the roof patched in places with sheets of tin. Inside were tools, old nails and scraps of lumber, things his father never threw away. Cooper barked suddenly sharp, an excited pause, digging into the muddy ground near the shed wall. Ethan frowned, set down his cup, and walked over. "What did you find there, buddy?" Cooper kept digging dirt, flying behind him. His nose pressed to the ground, his tail moving faster. Ethan knelt down and brushed away some of the loosened soil. Beneath the first layer of earth was something hard, the corner of what looked like a wooden lid. He ran his hand across the surface, feeling the smoothness of old timber. It was not just a board buried for storage. It was a box. He cleared more dirt until he could see the edges, a small wooden chest bound by rusted iron bands. The wood was dark, with age damp but solid. He tried to lift it, but it was heavy. After a few minutes of work, he managed to drag it free from the ground and placed it on the shed floor. Cooper sat beside him, panting happily, his tail thumping the ground, as if he knew he had done something important. Ethan stared at the chest for a while before opening it. The lock had long since rusted away, so he pried it loose with a screwdriver. The lid creaked open with a groan, releasing the musty smell of paper and time. Inside were several rolled sheets tied with string and a few notebooks bound in cracked leather. The papers were dry and surprisingly well preserved. On top lay a metal nameplate with the initials H. M. Henry Miller. Ethan froze. His father's handwriting filled the first page of the journal he opened, neat and deliberate, the letters dark with ink. He sat down on the floor beside the box and began to read. The first entries were dated more than 20 years ago. They described the building of the original water tunnels under the ridge, a network of stone-lined passages designed to carry fresh spring water to the town before modern pipes were installed. As he read further, the tone of the writing changed. His father wrote about strange visitors from the city, men in suits who came to survey the ridge and offered to buy the land. Henry refused. He wrote about being pressured to sell the plans, about threats disguised as offers. There was a page torn out, and on the next his handwriting grew more hurried, almost angry. They want the ridge for what lies beneath. The water is clean and endless. They will drain it dry if I let them. Ethan stopped reading, staring at the page. The truth began to take shape. His father had known about the underground spring, not just a local resource, but something valuable enough for companies to fight over. And he had tried to protect it. The entries near the end were shorter, scattered, as if written in fear. The last one simply said, "If they take this land, the town dies with it. I will hide what I can." Ethan leaned back against the wall, the journal heavy in his hands. The air inside the shed felt colder, now filled with dust and old ghosts. For years he had believed his father's reputation had been ruined because of some failed project, a mistake on the job site. People in town had whispered that Henry Miller lost his mind near the end, arguing with officials and refusing to cooperate. But now, Ethan understood. His father had not failed. He had been silenced. He looked down at Cooper, who rested his head on his paw, watching him with calm brown eyes. "You found this, did not you?" The dog tail moved once slow and content. Ethan reached out and scratched behind his ears. "Good boy." He turned his attention back to the chest. Beneath the journals were a few folded blueprints drawn in careful lines. They showed a cross-section of Hollow Ridge Hills tunnels and a thick line marked as the main aquifer. Red ink circled a section labeled East Hollow Entry Point. Ethan traced the line with his finger, recognizing the area. It was near where the new company had started sending survey teams the month before. The realization tightened his stomach. They must have found traces of the same water his father had hidden. He gathered the papers and placed them carefully in a clean box. As he did, he thought about his father's last days. The old man had died suddenly, after a fall on the ridge, something the town called an accident. But Ethan had always wondered if it was more. Reading these pages now made that doubt burn brighter. Outside, the morning had turned to noon. The sunlight slipped through the cracks in the shed wall, cutting the dust into bright lines. Ethan sat in that light for a while, lost in thought. The sound of cicadas rose in the distance, steady and endless. He thought about what to do next. Part of him wanted to march straight into town and show the papers to someone, maybe to Sarah, who knew more about local people than anyone, or to Mr. Grant, who might still know contacts in the county office. But another part of him, the soldier part, told him to wait, to watch, to learn who was behind the company that had bought the workshop land. He picked up the metal nameplate again and turned it over in his hand. The edges were rough, worn smooth in the middle by time. It reminded him of his father, hands steady, patient, marked by work, but never cruel. "You tried to protect it," he whispered, "and now it is my turn." He placed everything back into the chest, closed the lid, and carried it inside the house. Cooper followed close behind his paws, leaving prints on the dirt floor. Ethan set the chest near the table and sat beside it until the light outside began to fade. There was no noise but the steady sound of the dog breathing and the wind brushing through the trees. He knew life in Hollow Ridge was about to change again. For years, he had lived with the weight of loss and the feeling that his life had ended the day he left the army. But now, something had shifted. His father's voice had found him through the pages of that journal. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan had a purpose. The evening air in Hollow Ridge was thick with the smell of rain and dust. The sky was painted in deep shades of orange and gray as the sun slipped behind the low hills. Crickets had begun their slow, steady chorus, and the wooden fence around Ethan Miller property creaked in the cooling wind. It was the kind of quiet that seemed safe at first, but carried something uneasy beneath it. Ethan had spent the day inside the shed cleaning and organizing the papers from his father's chest. The blueprints now lay spread across the old workbench, lit by a single lamp. His hands moved, slowly, tracing the thin red lines drawn years ago. Each mark on the paper felt like a voice calling from the past. Cooper lay near the door, his golden fur glowing faintly under the lamplight, his ears twitching at every distant sound. As the light faded, the world outside began to shift. The road beyond the house grew darker and quieter. Ethan heard something snap in the distance, a branch maybe, or a step on loose gravel. Cooper lifted his head, a low growl rumbling from his chest. Ethan turned off the lamp, letting the shed fall into shadow. He listened. Another sound came this time, closer, the faint creak of the fence gate moving. He stepped outside, the air cool against his skin. Cooper followed, tense but silent. The yard lay dim in the last traces of twilight. Ethan's eyes adjusted, and he saw movement near the fence line. Two figures hunched low by the corner post. He could hear the metallic clink of a tool on wood. Someone was prying loose the boards. "Hey," he called, his voice steady but sharp. The figures froze for a heartbeat. Then one bolted toward the road, while the other turned and ran along the side of the fence. Cooper barked loud and charged, chasing the second intruder. The man stumbled, then swung a stick toward the dog, hitting him on the shoulder. Cooper yelped, but kept going, driving the stranger toward the gate. Ethan ran after them, his boots pounding the dirt. The man reached the fence and scrambled over, disappearing into the darkness. Cooper stopped, growling still, but limping slightly. Ethan knelt beside him, running his hand over the dog's shoulder, where the fur was matted with dirt and a small cut bled slowly. "Easy, boy, you did fine." He pressed his hand gently against the wound and led Cooper back to the porch. Ethan stood there, breathing hard, staring into the dark road. He could still hear the echo of footsteps fading into the hills. Whoever they were, they had known what they were looking for. The broken boards near the corner of the yard were fresh pried away with a crowbar. It was not random mischief. Someone had come for a reason. The next morning was heavy with gray clouds. Ethan cleaned Cooper's wound with warm water and wrapped it carefully with cloth. The dog bore it quietly, his eyes calm but alert. Afterward, Ethan brewed a pot of coffee and sat by the window, watching the empty road. His thoughts circled the same question: who would come out here in the dark to break through an old man fence? Around noon, a black car appeared at the end of the road. It was sleek and spotless, the kind that did not belong to this town. It rolled to a stop by the gate, and the engine cut off. A tall man stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of his white shirt. His hair was silver at the temples, but thick and neatly combed. He wore a dark gray suit and polished shoes that glinted even in the dust. The man's face was lean with sharp cheekbones and eyes that held the cold patience of someone used to being obeyed. Ethan stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Morning," he said cautiously. The man smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. "Mr. Miller, I presume. My name is Clayton. I represent a group of investors interested in acquiring property in this area. May I have a moment of your time?" Ethan studied him silently. Clayton's voice was smooth, practiced, the kind that carried power without needing to shout. He moved with confidence, but there was something measured in the way he looked around, as though taking inventory of the land itself. Ethan nodded once. "You can talk right here." Clayton's smile widened slightly. "Of course." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it forward. Inside were documents and a check already filled out. "I have an offer for your property, a very generous one. You see, we plan to develop this area, build something modern, something lasting. Your land happens to sit in the perfect location for our foundation work." Ethan glanced at the papers, but did not touch them. "This land belonged to my father. It is not for sale." Clayton tilted his head, the polite mask on his face, unmoving. "I understand attachment, Mr. Miller. We all have roots, but sometimes roots keep things from growing. I can assure you the price will more than compensate for sentiment." Ethan's jaw tightened. "This land is not for sale," he repeated slower this time. Clayton's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone stayed calm. "I hope you reconsider before construction begins. Once the company proceeds, it may complicate matters for you." The air between them went still. Ethan could hear Cooper moving behind him, the faint scrape of claws on wood. He met the man's eyes and said quietly, "There will be no construction here." Clayton adjusted his cuffs again, glancing at the wound on Cooper's bandaged shoulder. "Shame about the dog," he said. "These woods can be rough at night. Wild animals and all." Then he smiled again, turned, and walked back to the car. The engine started with a smooth hum, and the black vehicle rolled away down the road, leaving a trail of dust behind. Ethan stood watching until the car disappeared. His hands were clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. Inside, he felt the slow burn of anger and something heavier beneath it. Fear not for himself, but for what he now guarded. He went back inside and spread the blueprints on the table once more. The red markings stared back at him like warnings. East Hollow entry point. Clayton had not come by chance. He had known exactly where to look. Ethan could almost hear his father's voice echoing in memory. "You protect what matters, boy, even when no one else will." He looked down at Cooper, who rested near the hearth head on his paws. The bandage was already dirty from his restless movement. "You did good last night," Ethan said softly. Cooper's tail moved once in response. Ethan walked to the window again. Beyond the hills, the storm clouds had gathered darker now, heavy with the promise of rain. The land stretched quiet, but beneath the calm, something was shifting. He could feel it. The peace he had built these past weeks was gone, replaced by a cold determination. He whispered more to himself than anyone else. "They will not touch this land, not while I am breathing." The wind picked up outside, whistling through the trees. Cooper lifted his head, listening. Ethan closed the window and turned back toward the table. The blueprints lay under the lamplight, like a promise and a warning. The fight his father had started was not over. Now it belonged to him. The morning came with a restless sky. A low wind swept through Hollow Ridge, carrying the smell of damp soil and pine. The air felt heavy, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Ethan Miller stood outside his small house, the map of his father spread across the hood of his truck. His fingers traced the red lines that ran beneath the hills. They led toward something hidden, something that the men from the company would stop at nothing to claim. Cooper sat nearby, his fur still damp from the early dew. His golden coat shimmered faintly in the weak light. He watched Ethan closely, his eyes steady, as though understanding the weight of the morning. Ethan had not slept the night before. Clayton's visit still echoed in his head, every word a warning, every smile a threat. Yet now there was no room for fear. He had made a promise to his father and to himself. He folded the map carefully and slipped it into his jacket. The day had begun. Ethan and Cooper followed the narrow trail behind the house that wound through the trees toward the base of Hollow Ridge. The forest was thick this time of year, filled with the hum of insects and the rustle of branches. The ground was soft, and every step sank slightly into the damp earth. The scent of moss and roots filled the air. Ethan moved slowly, eyes scanning the hillside for anything that matched the old drawing. After nearly an hour of searching, Cooper stopped and began to bark softly, tail wagging. He stood near a cluster of rocks, half hidden by ivy. Ethan crouched beside him and brushed away the vines. Beneath them was a patch of rotting wood, the remnants of what looked like a boarded entrance. The boards were old water-stained and covered with moss. Ethan pressed against them, and they gave way, with a groan, revealing a dark opening that led downward. He took a deep breath and looked at Cooper. "You ready, boy?" The dog tilted his head and wagged his tail once. That was enough. Ethan reached for the flashlight hanging from his belt and shone it into the darkness. The air that came out was cool and stale, smelling of stone and thyme. Together, they stepped inside. The tunnel sloped gently downward, its walls lined with rough stones held together by clay and old timber supports. Water dripped from the ceiling in slow rhythm. Ethan's boots splashed in shallow puddles as he walked. He kept one hand against the wall for balance, the other gripping the flashlight. Cooper walked just ahead, ears alert, tail straight. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Ethan could hear the distant sound of running water echoing faintly from below. His father notes had mentioned a chamber near the lowest point of the ridge where the natural spring surfaced before flowing into the old water lines that fed the town. After several turns, the tunnel widened into a large stone chamber. The walls shimmered faintly with moisture, and at the center was a pool of clear water reflecting the beam of the flashlight. The surface rippled gently as if breathing. Ethan knelt beside it and filled his hand. The water was icy cold, but pure. He could see the bottom of the pool, smooth stone, untouched by time. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small camera and a notebook. He began recording the chamber, the walls, and the pool. He spoke softly as he filmed, describing the structure, the flow, and the location. This was proof of what his father had built and what others now wanted to destroy. Cooper paced near the tunnel entrance, ears twitching. A faint noise came from above, something distant but sharp. Ethan froze and turned off the light. He waited. Then he heard it again, this time closer, the echo of voices and the sound of boots scraping on stone. He whispered, "Cooper, we need to move." They slipped out of the chamber and back into the narrow passage. The flashlight stayed off. Ethan moved, by touch his heart pounding. The voices grew louder, echoing through the tunnels. Men were coming down, probably from the construction site above. The air filled with the clatter of tools and the muffled tone of a radio. Ethan and Cooper moved quickly through the darkness. The tunnel forked ahead, one path leading upward, the other descending into deeper shadow. Cooper stopped and sniffed the air, then turned toward the right-hand path. Ethan followed without question. The tunnel narrowed until he had to crouch. Dirt and dust filled the air, clinging to his clothes. Behind them came a flash of light, a flashlight beam sweeping through the tunnel. A voice shouted, "I see something." Then came the echo of running steps. Ethan pushed forward faster. The passage curved, and a faint glimmer of daylight appeared ahead. But between him and the exit was a low crawl space blocked partly by fallen stones. Cooper squeezed through, first his body twisting in the tight gap. Ethan followed, scraping his shoulders on the rock. The flashlight beam behind them grew brighter. When he finally burst out into open air, the world seemed blinding. They had emerged at the far side of the ridge near the edge of the forest. Cooper barked once, sharp and urgent. Ethan turned to see two men in work jackets climbing out of the tunnel behind them. Without thinking, he grabbed a handful of dirt and threw it toward the opening, then kicked loose a heavy stone. The rock rolled down and collapsed part of the entrance, sending a shower of dust and earth. That bought them seconds, no more. "Run, boy." Cooper dashed ahead, leading the way through the forest. Ethan followed branches whipping at his arms and face. His breath came fast, lungs burning, but he kept going. Cooper's tail flashed through the brush ahead like a golden trail. Behind them, voices shouted, but the sound grew fainter with every step. They crossed a small stream, climbed a low hill, and finally stopped in a clearing surrounded by tall trees. Ethan bent over, catching his breath. Cooper stood beside him, tongue out, sides heaving. The dog looked tired, but unhurt. Ethan placed a hand on his head. "You saved us again." The forest around them was still. Only the wind moved, rustling through the leaves. Ethan pulled the camera from his pocket and checked the footage. The screen showed clear images of the tunnel, the spring, and the blueprints he had held up for the recording. The proof was safe. He looked toward the ridge where the tunnel entrance lay hidden again. He knew the company would not stop now. They had seen enough to guess what he had found. The storm was coming, and this time it would not just be about land. It would be about truth and the legacy his father had left. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Ethan turned toward home. Cooper walked close beside him, his fur brushing against Ethan's leg. The bond between them felt stronger than ever, silent, steady, unbreakable. The dawn broke quietly over Hollow Ridge. A pale mist rolled through the trees, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and wet earth. The rain from the night before had ended, leaving the roads damp and the grass heavy with dew. The town was slowly waking, but a strange tension lingered in the air, a silence that felt like the moment before a storm. Ethan Miller stood on his porch, staring toward the hills that hid the tunnels beneath them. His face looked older than his years, his jaw shadowed with stubble, and his eyes lined with exhaustion. The last few days had been a blur of running, hiding, and recording everything he had seen. Cooper lay near his feet, head resting on his paws, his fur still streaked with dried mud from the forest. The dog watched him with the same calm loyalty that had carried them through every trial. Ethan knew what had to be done. He went inside and gathered the bag that held the camera and his father's papers. Every map, every drawing, every journal page had been carefully wrapped and protected. He took one last look around the house and whispered to Cooper, "Come on, boy, it is time." They drove into town as the sun rose higher. Hollow Ridge was small, its streets lined with old brick buildings and wooden storefronts. People moved slowly at this hour, shop owners unlocking doors, children walking with lunch boxes. Yet when Ethan parked outside the sheriff's office, heads began to turn. Everyone knew him. They knew the man who lived alone on the hill, the quiet veteran who fixed fences and built furniture, but never talked much about his past. Sheriff Tom Jacobs came out of the office as Ethan stepped from the truck. He was a big man in his late 50s, with broad shoulders and a weathered face framed by a short gray beard. His eyes were kind, but sharp, the eyes of a man who had seen too much and still believed in doing right. He had known Ethan's father once back when Hollow Ridge was still growing. "Morning, Ethan," he said slowly. "Heard you have been busy." Ethan nodded. "I need you to see something." Inside the small office, the air smelled of coffee and old paper. Ethan placed the camera and the folders on the desk. He turned on the screen and showed the sheriff the footage, the tunnels, the pool of clear water, the company workers chasing him. Jacobs watched in silence, his brow furrowing deeper with every image. When it ended, Ethan said quietly, "They found what my father was trying to protect. That spring runs beneath the ridge. They wanted to drain it and sell the rights. My father tried to stop them years ago. They ruined him for it. Now, they are trying again. Jacobs leaned back in his chair, hands folded over his belt. His voice was low but steady. That is a serious accusation. It is not an accusation, Ethan said. It is proof. The sheriff looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. I believe you. I will take this to the county office. But you should also talk to someone who can make this public fast before they bury it again. Ethan hesitated, then said, softly, there is a reporter from Cedar Falls. Her name is Anna Reed. She used to write about environmental cases. My father trusted her once. I will find her. Sheriff Jacobs reached across the desk and shook his hand. Be careful, Ethan. You have stirred something big. Ethan left the station and drove east toward Cedar Falls. Cooper sat beside him, head out the window, ears flapping in the wind. The morning sun burned away the mist, revealing rolling green hills that seemed peaceful again, though he knew danger still hid beneath. By noon, he reached the small newspaper office on the edge of town. The building was modest, its windows covered with faded posters and stacks of old papers inside. Anna Reed was standing near the counter, sorting through a pile of folders. She was in her 30s, tall, with shoulder-length auburn hair, and a freckled face that carried both warmth and sharp intelligence. Her clothes were simple, a white shirt and worn jeans, but her posture held confidence. When Ethan introduced himself, she studied him with curious eyes, then gestured for him to sit. I knew your father, she said. He was stubborn as the mountains around here. What brings you to me? Ethan opened the bag and spread the documents on the table. His voice stayed calm, but beneath it ran the strain of days without rest. He told her about the tunnels, the men who attacked his home, and the proof he had gathered. Anna listened without interruption, writing notes quickly, her expression shifting from skepticism to concern. When he finished, she said quietly, This is big, Ethan. If I publish this, it will bring the state investigators down here in a day, but it will also make you a target. Ethan met her gaze. I do not care. My father died trying to protect this land. I will not let them finish what they started. Anna nodded slowly, then reached for her phone. I will send this to my editor tonight, and I will make sure your name and your father name are in every line. People will know what really happened at Hollow Ridge. By evening, the first report had gone online. Within hours, it spread across the county. Words like illegal water rights and corporate corruption filled the headlines. The company that Clayton represented was named directly. By the next morning, state inspectors arrived in town, followed by news vans and reporters. Sheriff Jacobs stood outside the station, giving statements, while Ethan watched from a distance. He was not a man who liked crowds or attention, but now there was no choice. People began to gather around him, neighbors who had barely spoken to him before. They thanked him one by one for protecting the ridge, for saving their water and their town. Some brought food. Others simply shook his hand with tears in their eyes. Sarah Harper was among them. She walked toward him carrying a basket of bread, still warm from the oven. Her dark hair was tied back, and her tired face seemed softer than usual. She handed him the basket and said quietly, You did what no one else could. My father used to say, your dad was the kind of man who never ran from what was right. I see now it runs in the family. Ethan smiled faintly. I just did what he would have done. Beside him, Cooper wagged his tail as Lily knelt down to hug him. The girl laughed as the dog licked her face, leaving muddy streaks on her cheek. Around them, the townspeople began to cheer, when a local radio announced that the state had officially suspended all operations by the company pending investigation. Clayton's name was under review and the project frozen. The sun dipped low, turning the rooftops gold. The town square buzzed with life for the first time in years. Music played from a cafe nearby. Children ran through the open street chasing each other, while adults spoke with excitement about rebuilding the ridge without fear. Ethan stood quietly near the edge of it all. The noise faded around him, replaced by the simple sound of Cooper breathing and the rustle of wind through the trees. He thought of his father, the weight of his hand guiding him as a boy, the smell of sawdust in the old workshop, and the quiet dignity of a man who built things to last. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt peace. Not the kind born from silence, but the kind that comes from doing what must be done. He looked down at Cooper, who sat proudly by his side chest, out eyes bright. "You did, good partner." The dog wagged his tail and leaned against his leg. Together, they watched the lights of Hollow Ridge flicker on, one by one, glowing like stars across the valley. The morning sun spilled gently across Hollow Ridge, warming the hills and rooftops. The air was clear and cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and freshly cut wood. A year had passed since the storm of greed and fear that once threatened the valley. The land had healed, and so had the hearts of those who called it home. Ethan Miller stood outside the newly restored workshop beside his house. The wooden sign above the door read, "Cooper and Miller Woodworks," carved neatly by his own hand. The letters were smooth and deep, the kind of craft that spoke of patience and pride. Behind him, the sound of saws and hammers echoed in rhythm. A few young men worked inside shaping planks and sanding frames, while laughter and talk blended with the hum of the tools. Ethan was 43 now, his hair a little grayer, his hands still rough from years of work. The lines on his face had softened, though his eyes still carried the steady calm of a man who had faced storms and walked through them. He wore a plain shirt, rolled to the elbows, and faded jeans, the same kind he used to wear in his father's shop. He looked around the yard, watching the rhythm of a day beginning. Cooper lay near the porch, his golden fur catching the sunlight like a halo. The dog was older now, his muzzle touched with white, but his eyes remained bright and full of the same warmth that had carried Ethan through every dark hour. He lifted his head when Ethan called his name, then rested again with a slow wag of his tail. Inside the workshop, two young apprentices were arguing good-naturedly over a piece of oak. One of them, Jake, was barely 20, thin and tall, with a tangle of dark hair and an easy grin. He had come from the neighboring town after hearing Ethan was teaching carpentry for free to anyone willing to work hard. The other, Mark, a quiet farm boy with strong shoulders and kind eyes, looked up to Ethan the way a son might look to a father. Ethan smiled as he watched them both. It reminded him of his own youth and the lessons his father had once taught in this very place. Sarah Harper appeared from the doorway, carrying a tray of sandwiches and a pitcher of lemonade. The years had softened her too. She was tall and graceful, her dark hair streaked faintly with silver that only made her look wiser. Her hands were still slender and quick, but now they moved with ease, not hurry. Her face carried the gentle strength of someone who had learned to live again. She had taken charge of the workshop accounts and managed the small orders from town. Beside her, Lily, now 14, ran with a bundle of small carvings she had made herself. The girl laughter filled the room, and even the sound of the tools seemed to slow to listen. Ethan took the tray from Sarah and said quietly, "You have kept this place alive more than I ever could." She smiled her eyes, reflecting both gratitude and affection. "You built it, Ethan. We only followed where you led." He looked at her for a long moment, saying nothing more. Some things no words could express. By afternoon, the workshop was full of life. Customers from town came to collect furniture and small crafts. Children played near the fence, chasing Cooper, who barked lazily before lying back down again. The air was warm with the smell of pine sap and sawdust. On one wall hung a framed photograph of Henry Miller standing beside a younger Ethan, both smiling beside the old lathe. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "For those who build, not for profit, but for purpose." Ethan paused before it, sometimes just to breathe. In that picture, his father eyes seemed alive, watching over everything that had grown from his dream. The guilt and grief that had once haunted Ethan had faded, replaced by quiet pride. He had done what his father could not. He had protected Hollow Ridge and kept its heart beating. Later that evening, when the workday ended, Ethan sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. The hills glowed gold under the setting sun. From here, he could see the roofs of the town, the steeple of the small church, and beyond that, the ridge itself, now protected by law as a natural reserve. He thought of the months that followed the investigation, how the company had been dismantled and Clayton arrested, how the town had changed slowly from suspicion to unity. He also thought of the people, of Sheriff Jacobs, who still stopped by every Sunday morning for coffee before church, his laugh echoing across the porch, of Anna Reed, whose articles had turned Hollow Ridge into a symbol of resilience across the state, of Sarah and Lily, who had brought warmth back into his home, turning what was once silence into laughter. Cooper shifted beside him, letting out a small sigh. Ethan reached down and brushed his hand along the dog fur, feeling the familiar warmth beneath. The bond between them had never faded. He could still remember the nights in the forest, the sound of pursuit, the flash of danger. But those memories no longer hurt. They had become proof of endurance. Sarah stepped outside, drying her hands on a towel. "Supper is ready," she said softly. He nodded, but did not move yet. He was watching the sunset, the way the light stretched long across the valley, catching the dust in golden beams. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked, standing beside him. He shook his head. "I left once, and it took me half a life to find my way back." She smiled understanding. Then she called Lily, who came running barefoot across the yard, her hair catching the fading light. Cooper lifted his head to watch her, then settled again with a soft huff. As night came, the sounds of Hollow Ridge grew quiet. The last of the birds called from the trees, and somewhere a dog barked in the distance. Ethan stayed on the porch long after the others had gone inside. The stars came out one by one until the sky was full of them. He thought of his father again and whispered, as if the wind might carry the words upward, "We did it, Dad." He rose and walked back toward the workshop. Inside, the smell of wood lingered, mixed with oil and varnish. The tools were neatly arranged, the workbenches clean. The place felt alive. On the main table sat a new carving, a small wooden plaque that read, "Cooper and Miller Forever." He smiled and turned off the light. Outside, the porch lamp cast a soft glow over the yard. Cooper had fallen asleep, his head resting on his paws, his chest rising and falling slowly. Ethan sat beside him once more. The air warmed, the world finally still. For the first time in many years, he felt no weight, no fear, only peace. He looked out at the dark horizon and said quietly to himself, "The light stays here." The wind moved through the valley, carrying the scent of pine and home. In that quiet golden place, Ethan Miller and his loyal dog had finally found what they had both been searching for. As time moved gently over Hollow Ridge, the story of Ethan and Cooper became more than memory. It became part of the valley itself. The workshop that once stood silent now rang with the laughter of new hands, learning old crafts. The fields where greed once shadowed now blossomed with honest work and quiet faith. The people who once lived in fear had learned to stand together again. The spring beneath the ridge flowed freely, its clear water, a reminder that truth cannot be buried forever. Ethan often sat outside the workshop at dusk, watching the light stretch across the valley. Sometimes he would think of how far he had come from the man who returned home with nothing but a loyal dog and a past full of pain. He had found peace not through wealth or power, but through purpose. The valley had taught him that healing begins with kindness, that faith is not built in grand gestures, but in small acts of goodness done every day. Cooper still lay beside him each evening, breathing slow and deep, the rhythm of a loyal heart that never wavered. The world had changed, yet what mattered most remained: love, loyalty, and the quiet strength to begin again. And perhaps that is the miracle of life, that no matter how broken a person may be, grace can still find them. It may come in the form of a faithful dog, or the warmth of a helping hand, or the whisper of the wind that carries a prayer across the hills. For those who keep faith, the light never truly leaves. If this story has touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on your own blessings. Share this story so that others may remember the power of love and redemption. Leave a comment to tell where you are watching from and how the story spoke to you. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of hope and devotion. May God watch over you and your loved ones, and may His light guide your path each day with peace, strength, and grace.